Have you ever felt trapped in a life where every choice feels like it's already been made for you? Meet Janet, a mother who's been holding her family together while silently suffering through years of emotional abuse. But now things are changing. In this powerful story, we'll follow Janet as she faces impossible challenges, both at home and in her heart, to reclaim her life and protect her children. What will happen when she finally decides to break free? Will she find the strength to stand up against the person who's controlled her for so long? Stick with us, because you won't want to miss the twists and turns in Janet's journey to independence. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next chapter drops. Let's dive in. Janet Wilson had always dreamed of a peaceful life, one where her family could thrive without the shadows of her past following her. But peace seemed increasingly out of reach, especially after years trapped in a suffocating marriage with Michael. He, a man who once promised love and support, had now become an oppressive presence, feeding on her insecurities and controlling every aspect of her existence. In their small house, nestled in a modest suburb, the walls seemed to close in on Janet. The air inside was heavy, not just from the lack of space, but from years of emotional and psychological abuse that Michael had inflicted upon her. He had never been physically violent, but his words were sharp weapons that slowly cut deep, leaving invisible scars that hurt just as much. That morning, like countless others, Janet woke before dawn. The routine was always the same. Prepare the coffee, get the kids' things ready, and ensure everything was perfect before Michael came downstairs. He liked order, and any deviation was enough to trigger his criticism. She tried hard not to give him any reason, but somehow he always found something. "You can't do anything right, Janet," he would say, not raising his voice, but with a coldness that made her shrink inside. The children, Malik and Sarah, slept in the room next door. Malik, at 12 years old, was starting to pick up on the tensions that filled the house. He tried to protect his mother in whatever small ways he could, but he was still too young to fully grasp what was happening. Sarah, only 7, was still innocent enough not to catch all the nuances, but her withdrawn behavior reflected the tense environment she was growing up in. That morning, as Janet stood before the mirror combing her hair, she reflected on the path that had led her here. She had once been strong, or at least she used to think so. She grew up in a poor but close-knit family, and from an early age, she learned to fight for everything she wanted. The racism she faced throughout her life had shaped her, teaching her to stand firm, but somehow, along the way, she had lost herself. When she met Michael, he seemed like the answer to all her problems. He had a steady job, a respectable appearance, and promised a future Janet had never imagined she could have. But over the years, his promises proved empty, and the life she had built with him had turned into a prison. This can't go on, she thought, as she finished setting the breakfast table. She knew she had to make a decision, but the thought of leaving Michael terrified her, not just because of the fear of the unknown, but because she knew he wouldn't let her go easily. He controlled her financially and emotionally, and every time Janet thought about leaving, Michael would remind her of everything she stood to lose. The sound of heavy footsteps descending the stairs pulled her back to the present. Michael entered the kitchen, barely acknowledging her, grabbing his coffee as if she were invisible. Janet watched in silence, feeling the mix of anger and sadness swirl inside her. She knew she had to find a way out, not just for herself, but for her children. They deserved a better life, one where they could grow up free from fear and oppression. Michael finally broke the silence, his usual tone of disdain evident. "I hope you didn't forget to pay the bills this month. If I have to deal with another late notice, you're going to regret it," he said, looking at her as though she was a burden in his life. Janet felt the knot in her throat tighten, but she swallowed the anger. She knew she couldn't afford a confrontation, not yet. But something inside her was beginning to change. She wouldn't be the same Janet for long. Not anymore. Later that morning, Janet dropped the kids off at school, her mind still replaying the interactions with Michael. As she drove through the quiet streets, she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. The day was just beginning, but the exhaustion was already setting in. She had grown accustomed to this a life of surviving rather than living. But today, something in her shifted. The decision she had been avoiding for years was slowly taking shape in her mind. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Janet glanced at it, seeing Michael's name flash across the screen. A knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello?" Her voice was soft, barely masking the tension. "I need you to come by the office today." Michael's voice was stern and impatient. "There's something I need you to handle." Janet frowned. Michael rarely involved her in his work, and when he did, it was usually to fix a mess he couldn't be bothered with. But refusing wasn't an option. "I'll be there soon," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. After dropping Sarah at school, Janet made her way to Michael's office. The building was in the heart of downtown, a place Janet rarely visited. It was a symbol of everything Michael represented: control, power, and a life she no longer wanted. As she entered the sleek, modern building, the coldness of the space mirrored the emotional distance between them. Michael was waiting for her in his office, seated behind a large mahogany desk, his expression as unreadable as ever. "I need you to take care of this," he said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. "The house repairs. It's becoming too much of a hassle, and I don't have time to deal with it." Janet looked at the papers in front of her. They detailed extensive repairs for their home, repairs Michael had ignored for months. Now, when things had worsened, he expected her to fix everything without giving her the authority or resources to make real decisions. "Why don't you handle this yourself?" Janet asked, her voice calm but firm. Michael's eyes narrowed. "Don't question me, Janet. You've never had a problem doing what you're told before. What's changed?" Her heart pounded, anger simmering beneath her skin. She knew what had changed. She had changed. But Michael wasn't ready to hear that. He wasn't ready to see the woman standing before him, tired of being the obedient wife he had always expected her to be. "I'll take care of it," she muttered, grabbing the papers and turning toward the door. "Make sure you do it right this time," Michael called after her. His words hit her like a blow, sharp and dismissive. Janet walked out of his office, the weight of the papers in her hands feeling heavier than they should. This was her life. Constantly cleaning up after Michael, constantly being told she wasn't good enough. The injustice of it all boiled in her chest. She wasn't just dealing with a broken house. Her entire life felt like it was falling apart. And Michael? He barely noticed, too caught up in his world of control and manipulation. As she walked back to the car, Janet thought about the years she had spent trying to keep everything together. She had been holding on for the sake of her children, for the sake of appearances. But now, for the first time, she saw things clearly. Michael had taken more from her than she had realized. Her independence, her self-worth, her dreams. All had been chipped away, bit by bit, until she was left with this shell of a life. Janet sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the stack of papers in her hands. She was tired of being the one to fix everything while Michael reaped the benefits. It was time for things to change. But how? How could she break free from the life she had built, even if it was crumbling around her? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Sarah's school. Janet's heart sank as she read the text. "We need to discuss Sarah's behavior. Please schedule a meeting at your earliest convenience." Another problem, another burden. The school had never been this direct before. Janet's hands trembled as she typed a quick reply. She could feel the weight of it all crushing her, but she wasn't sure how much more she could take. As she started the car and drove away from Michael's office, Janet realized that this wasn't just about the house repairs or Sarah's behavior. This was about her life and how it had been slowly falling apart. She had been stuck in this cycle of fixing things for everyone else, for Michael, for the kids, for the world. But who was there to fix her? The anger that had been simmering inside her began to take a new shape. It wasn't just anger at Michael or at the injustices she faced every day. It was anger at herself for allowing this to go on for so long, for accepting a life that wasn't hers, for forgetting who she was. Janet gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing. This was the first step. She didn't know exactly what she needed to do, but she knew one thing for sure: things were going to change, and they would change soon. Have you ever felt the weight of a decision that could change everything? Janet is at a crossroads, and the challenges ahead will shake her life in ways she never expected. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you can follow every twist and turn in this intense story. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life. Join us and witness the strength of the human spirit. Janet knew she had to deal with Sarah's situation, but her mind was spinning from the confrontation with Michael. The drive to the school felt longer than usual, the silence in the car pressing down on her. Her children were her world, and the thought of something being wrong with Sarah filled her with dread. At the school, the principal, Mrs. Jenkins, greeted her with a warm but concerned expression. Janet could see in her eyes that this was not a casual meeting. She was ushered into a small office, where Sarah's teacher, Ms. Wallace, was already seated, waiting. "Mrs. Wilson, thank you for coming in on such short notice," Ms. Wallace began, her tone polite but firm. "We've noticed some concerning behavior from Sarah in the past few weeks. She's become withdrawn, more quiet than usual, and we're worried it's affecting her ability to engage with her classmates." Janet's heart sank. Sarah had always been a quiet child, but this was different. She hadn't realized just how much her daughter was struggling. Guilt washed over her. She had been so consumed with her own problems, with Michael, that she hadn't seen what was happening to her own child. "I had no idea," Janet said softly, her voice trembling. "Is there anything specific that triggered this?" Ms. Wallace exchanged a glance with Mrs. Jenkins before continuing. "Sarah mentioned something to one of the other students about her father. She seemed upset, and when we tried to talk to her about it, she shut down completely." The words hit Janet like a ton of bricks. She knew what this was about. Sarah was old enough to sense the tension between her parents, to understand that something wasn't right, even if she couldn't fully comprehend it. Janet had tried so hard to shield her children from the ugliness of her relationship with Michael, but it was clear now that she had failed. "We're here to support Sarah in any way we can," Mrs. Jenkins said gently, "but we believe she may benefit from some counseling. It might help her process whatever is going on at home." Janet nodded, barely able to keep her emotions in check. The meeting ended shortly after, and Janet left the school feeling more overwhelmed than ever. Not only was she trapped in a toxic marriage, but now her daughter was paying the price for it. The weight of it all felt unbearable. As she walked back to the car, her phone rang again. It was Michael. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Where are you?" His voice was cold, demanding. "I'm handling it," Janet replied, her voice flat. "Handling what?" Michael's tone was laced with impatience. "Sarah's school called. She's having some issues," Janet began, but Michael cut her off. "I don't have time for this, Janet. Whatever it is, deal with it. And don't make a big deal out of nothing. You're always overreacting," he snapped before hanging up. Janet stood in the parking lot, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the call ended. The familiar sting of his words cut deep, but this time, it felt different. This time, it wasn't just about her. It was about Sarah and Malik and the life she had allowed them to grow up in. The drive home was a blur. Janet's mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. She thought about Michael's dismissive attitude, the way he had shrugged off Sarah's struggles as if they were nothing. It was one thing for him to treat her that way, but she wouldn't let him do the same to their children. When she arrived home, the house felt colder than usual. The silence was suffocating. Malik was in his room doing homework, and Sarah sat on the living room floor, playing with her dolls in silence. Janet watched her for a moment, her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter's small figure hunched over, the weight of her young world already too heavy to bear. As she prepared dinner that evening, Janet's thoughts kept circling back to the same conclusion. This life wasn't sustainable. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that Michael's behavior was normal, that the children were unaffected. It was tearing them all apart. Michael came home late as usual. He barely acknowledged Janet or the kids, heading straight to the living room and turning on the television. His presence in the house was like a dark cloud, spreading tension through every room. Janet served dinner in silence, her mind already forming a plan, even if she didn't quite know how to execute it yet. As they sat at the table, the tension between Janet and Michael was palpable. Malik and Sarah sensed it, their eyes flicking between their parents as they ate in silence. Michael, oblivious or simply uncaring, continued eating as if everything was normal. After dinner, Janet tucked the kids into bed, her heart heavy with guilt and sadness. She kissed Malik on the forehead and lingered at Sarah's door, watching her daughter sleep. Janet knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to do something, not just for herself, but for her children. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Janet's mind raced with possibilities. She had no money of her own, no savings to fall back on. Michael had made sure of that. He controlled everything, the finances, the house, even the way she thought about herself. But she had something stronger than money, her will to protect her children. That night, Janet made a decision. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but she was going to leave Michael. She didn't have a clear plan yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. The injustice of it all, the way Michael had stripped her of her independence, the way he dismissed their children's struggles, the way he had turned her life into a nightmare, was too much to bear. Janet didn't sleep that night, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope. It was faint, barely visible under the weight of her fears and doubts, but it was there, and it was enough to keep her going. The next morning, Janet awoke to the soft light filtering through the curtains. Despite the decision she had made the night before, the reality of what lay ahead weighed heavily on her. She moved through the motions of her routine, but her mind was elsewhere. Planning, imagining, fearing. The uncertainty of how she would leave Michael, of how she would protect her children and herself, gnawed at her. But deep down, she knew there was no turning back. As she packed lunches for Malik and Sarah, she glanced at the clock. Michael would be leaving soon for work, and with him gone, the house would be quieter, a brief respite from the tension that filled the air when he was home. She was grateful for these small moments of peace, but they only served as a reminder of how much she had lost. Michael entered the kitchen, adjusting his tie and grabbing his coffee from the counter without a word. Janet watched him, wondering how they had ended up here. Two people living under the same roof, but miles apart. There was a time long ago when she had loved him, when he had been her escape from the harshness of the world. But now he was just another source of pain, another reminder of how trapped she was. Michael's behavior had always been controlling, but it hadn't always been this severe. In the beginning, there were glimpses of the man he had pretended to be, kind, attentive, and supportive. But those moments had grown fewer over the years, replaced by his obsession with power and control. He thrived on it, needing to feel superior to everyone around him, especially Janet. As Janet watched him now, she saw the cracks in his facade. The subtle way his jaw tightened when things didn't go his way, the way he never met her eyes anymore. Michael wasn't just a man who controlled others. He was a man who feared losing control. And that fear, Janet realized, was at the heart of everything. She remembered a time, early in their marriage, when Michael had lost his job. He had been devastated not just because of the financial strain, but because of what it meant for his identity. He had always tied his self-worth to his success, to his ability to provide and dominate in the workplace. For weeks, he had lashed out at Janet, blaming her for his failures, as though she were the reason he had been laid off. It was during that time that his need for control became most apparent. Michael's racial biases, though subtle, had always been a part of their relationship. He had grown up in a conservative, mostly white family, where discussions of race were taboo, and the idea of a strong black woman was something to be feared, not celebrated. Janet had sensed his discomfort with her strength early on, but at the time, she had brushed it off, believing that love would overcome such differences. But over the years, his biases had seeped into their relationship, slowly eroding the foundation they had once built together. There were moments when Michael's words were tinged with condescension, as if he saw her not as an equal, but as someone to be tolerated, someone whose value was less because of her race. He never said it outright, but it was there, in the way he spoke about her family, in the way he dismissed her opinions, and in the way he subtly suggested that her struggles were her own fault. It had taken Janet years to fully understand the depth of his racism, masked by his charm and social status. As she stood in the kitchen now, watching him prepare to leave for work, Janet couldn't help but feel a surge of anger. He had taken so much from her, her independence, her confidence, her sense of self. And yet, he acted as though she were the one who owed him something, as though she should be grateful for the life he had provided. But there was another side to Michael, a side that even he didn't fully understand. Beneath his exterior of control and power, there was insecurity, a fear that one day, everything he had built would crumble. He feared losing Janet, not because he loved her, but because she represented his ability to dominate, to control. If she left, it would mean he had failed, and that was something Michael could never accept. Janet saw this now, clearer than ever. Michael wasn't just her antagonist. He was his own worst enemy, trapped in a cycle of fear and control that would ultimately destroy him. For so long, Janet had seen herself as the victim, but now she realized that Michael was just as trapped as she was. Trapped by his own insecurities, his own prejudices, his own need for power. As he left the house that morning, Janet felt a strange sense of pity for him. She knew what it was like to feel trapped, to live in fear. But unlike Michael, she was ready to break free. She was ready to fight for her independence, for her children, and for the life she deserved. Later that day, after the kids had gone to school, Janet sat down at the kitchen table, a notebook and pen in front of her. She had spent so many years avoiding this moment, but now there was no turning back. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. Her first step was finding a way to support herself. Michael controlled all the finances, but Janet had skills. Skills she had buried over the years but could now use to her advantage. She had once worked as an assistant, managing schedules and organizing events. She was good at it, and with a little effort, she could find work again. The second step was finding a place to live. This would be harder. Michael would never let her take the kids, and even if he did, she had no money to rent a place of her own. But Janet wasn't going to give up. She had friends, people who would help her if she asked, though asking for help was something Janet had always struggled with. It was time to let go of her pride and focus on what mattered most: her children's safety and her own freedom. As she wrote down her thoughts, a plan began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, Janet felt like she was in control of her own life again. For the next few days, Janet carried on with her plan in secret. Every moment she had alone, she dedicated to figuring out the logistics of her escape. She contacted an old friend, Lisa, who worked at a nonprofit organization that helped women in abusive situations. Lisa was the only person Janet could trust, and their conversations became a lifeline for her. Lisa assured her that she would help Janet find a temporary place to stay and connect her with legal advice for custody of the children. The small steps gave Janet a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. It was terrifying, but she was finally taking control. Every night, as she lay in bed, she imagined what life could be like without Michael, what it would feel like to wake up in the morning without the constant pressure, to raise her children in a home filled with love rather than fear. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Janet received a call from Lisa. "I have good news," Lisa said, her voice filled with excitement. "There's a program through my organization that provides housing for women in your situation. It's not permanent, but it's a start. And the best part? You could move in as soon as next week." Janet felt a surge of relief. "Next week," she repeated, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Yes, but you need to be ready. It's a small apartment, but it's in a safe neighborhood, and you won't have to worry about Michael finding you. You can start fresh." For the first time in a long time, Janet allowed herself to feel hopeful. She could see the end of the tunnel, the possibility of freedom. "Thank you, Lisa. I don't know what I would do without you." "You don't have to do this alone, Janet. We're going to get you and the kids out of there safely," Lisa assured her. As Janet hung up the phone, her mind was spinning. In just a week, she could be out of this house, away from Michael's control. The thought gave her strength, but also filled her with dread. How would Michael react? Would he try to stop her? The fear gnawed at her, but Janet was determined. She wouldn't let anything stand in her way now. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, new complications arose. The next morning, as Janet was getting ready to take the kids to school, Michael walked into the kitchen, an unusual expression on his face, one that Janet hadn't seen in years. He looked calm. "Janet," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking, maybe we should go on a trip. Just the two of us. Get away from everything and reconnect." Janet froze, her mind racing. This was unexpected. Michael never suggested spending time together. In fact, for the past few years, he had barely acknowledged her existence beyond the necessities. And now he wanted to reconnect? "I know things have been difficult," he continued, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. "But I've been thinking a lot about us. About the kids. Maybe we need a fresh start. A fresh start." The words hung in the air, almost mocking her. This was what she wanted, wasn't it? A chance to start over, to rebuild her life. But not like this. Not with Michael. Janet didn't know what to say. Her instinct told her this was a trap, that Michael sensed her pulling away and was trying to reel her back in. But a small part of her, one that had been buried under years of pain, wanted to believe him. What if he had changed? What if he really did want to make things better? "I don't know," Janet stammered, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. Michael stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Janet, I'm serious. I've been working too much. I know that, but I want to fix things. For us, for the kids." The softness in his voice unsettled her. It was so unlike him, so out of character, that it felt wrong. And yet, Janet found herself hesitating. Maybe this was her chance. Maybe Michael had finally realized the damage he had done. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. "I'll think about it," Janet replied cautiously, her heart pounding. Michael nodded, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for some sign of agreement. "Good. I'll make the arrangements." As he left the room, Janet's mind was in turmoil. What had just happened? This wasn't the Michael she knew. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this sudden change was too convenient, too calculated. She wanted to believe that things could change, that her life could improve without having to leave everything behind. But deep down, she knew that was a fantasy. Later that day, Janet confided in Lisa about Michael's proposal. "He wants to take me on a trip," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. "He says he wants to reconnect, to fix things." Lisa's response was immediate. "Janet, you can't trust this. It's classic manipulation. He senses that you're slipping away, and he's trying to pull you back in. This is a trap." Janet sighed. "I know. I want to believe him, but I just don't think I can." "Listen to your gut," Lisa urged. "You've come this far. Don't let him pull you back into his web." Janet nodded. Even though Lisa couldn't see her, she knew Lisa was right. Michael's sudden change of heart wasn't genuine. It was a desperate attempt to maintain control. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at her. What if she was wrong? What if Michael really did want to change? That night, Michael brought up the trip again, pressing her for a decision. Janet stalled, telling him she needed more time to think. She knew she couldn't delay much longer. Soon, she would have to make a choice. But for now, she focused on her plan. The apartment was still waiting for her. She just had to hold on a little longer. As she lay in bed that night, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She could go on the trip with Michael, pretend that things could be fixed, or she could leave and face the uncertainty of the future on her own. It was a decision that would change everything. And yet, as the days passed, Michael's behavior became more erratic. His calm demeanor was replaced by bouts of anger and frustration. He sensed that Janet was holding something back, and the more she resisted, the more aggressive he became. The false hope he had offered was gone, replaced by the familiar pattern of control and manipulation. Janet knew then that there was no going back. Michael would never change. The only way forward was to leave, no matter how hard it would be. She couldn't fall for his promises again. She had to be strong, for herself and for her children. The next week, Janet packed a small bag for herself and the kids, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let Michael control her life any longer. It was time to leave. The morning of their planned departure arrived sooner than Janet had expected. She moved through the house like a shadow, quietly packing the essentials: clothes, important documents, and small keepsakes for the kids. Malik and Sarah were still asleep, unaware of the drastic change about to unfold in their lives. Janet's hands trembled as she placed the last of their things in a small duffel bag. She had made arrangements with Lisa, who would meet her later that day to take them to the safe apartment. Janet felt a gnawing anxiety deep in her stomach. Despite all her preparations, the fear of Michael finding out lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. She glanced at the clock. Michael would be home for lunch soon, and she had to be gone by then. Just as Janet zipped up the bag, the front door swung open. Michael stood there, his expression tense and unreadable. Her heart sank. He wasn't supposed to be home this early. What's going on? His eyes narrowed, immediately noticing the packed bags. Janet could see the calculation happening behind his gaze as he pieced it together. For a moment, the air was sucked out of the room. Janet's mouth went dry. She had to think quickly, to say something before the situation spiraled out of control. She stammered, trying to form a coherent explanation, but nothing came to mind. The lie she had prepared in case of this very moment evaporated from her thoughts. Michael's eyes darkened. "You're leaving, aren't you?" His voice was dangerously low, barely containing his anger. Janet felt a wave of panic rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm taking the kids to visit my sister. I thought it would be good for them to get out of the house for a few days," she lied, her voice shaking. "I was going to tell you, but—" "Don't lie to me, Janet," Michael shouted, stepping closer to her, his presence looming. "You think I don't know what's going on? You've been acting strange for weeks. You're trying to leave me, aren't you?" Janet froze, her pulse racing. She had no way out. He knew. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been so careful, but Michael had always been perceptive, always watching. And now there was no escape. What were you planning to do? Run off in the middle of the day? Take my children away from me? Michael's voice was rising, the tension in the room thick and oppressive. "They're my children too, Michael," Janet shot back, her own anger breaking through her fear. "You don't own them. You don't own me." Michael's face twisted in fury. "I've provided everything for this family. I've given you everything you needed. And this is how you repay me? By sneaking around, trying to take them away?" Janet took a step back, her hands trembling. She knew she had to stand her ground, but the fear was overwhelming. Michael had never laid a hand on her, but in this moment, she wasn't sure what he was capable of. "You've controlled everything, Michael," Janet said, her voice shaking. "You've taken everything from me, my independence, my dignity. I can't live like this anymore. The kids deserve better, and so do I." For a moment, Michael just stood there, breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. Janet could see the conflict in his eyes. He wasn't just angry. He was scared. Scared of losing control, of losing the power he had over her and their family. "You're not going anywhere," Michael finally said, his voice cold and final. "You think you can just walk out of here and take the kids? You're nothing without me, Janet. You can't survive on your own." The words cut deep, but Janet knew they weren't true. She had spent years believing Michael's lies, believing that she was weak, that she needed him. But not anymore. "I'm leaving, Michael," Janet said, her voice firmer this time. "And you can't stop me." Michael's expression darkened, and he stepped forward again, closing the distance between them. Janet's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. Suddenly, Malik's voice broke through the tension. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" Janet turned to see her son standing at the edge of the hallway, his face pale and confused. Behind him, Sarah stood clutching her doll, wide-eyed with fear. Michael glared at Janet before turning his attention to Malik. "Go back to your room," he barked. "No!" Janet's voice was loud and clear, surprising even herself. Malik, Sarah, we're leaving. Go get your things. Malik hesitated for a moment, glancing between his parents. Janet could see the confusion in his eyes, the uncertainty. But after a beat, he nodded and took Sarah's hand, leading her back down the hallway. Michael's fury erupted. You think you can just walk out of here? I won't let you take them. Janet felt her own anger boil over. This is exactly why I'm leaving, Michael. You don't get to decide everything anymore. I'm their mother, and I'm taking them to a place where they can be safe, where they don't have to live in fear. Michael lunged toward her, but Janet stood her ground. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of his threats. She had finally reached her breaking point. At that moment, Janet's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Lisa, calling to confirm their meeting spot. Without taking her eyes off Michael, she answered the call. Lisa, we're coming. Be ready. Michael's face contorted in rage. You're not going anywhere, he shouted, his voice shaking the walls. But Janet was already moving toward the door. Yes, we are, she said, her voice steady and unwavering. And you can't stop me. With that, she grabbed the bag and motioned for the kids to follow. Malik and Sarah hurried toward the door, their small hands gripping hers tightly. Janet could feel their fear, but she also felt their trust in her. She was their mother, and she would protect them no matter what. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, his face red with fury, but he didn't move. He didn't try to stop them. Janet walked out of the house, her children by her side, and for the first time in years, she felt free. As they drove away, Janet's hands were still shaking, but the weight of fear had begun to lift. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She would never let anyone control her or her children again. This was the beginning of their new life. As Janet drove away from the house, her heart pounded in her chest. She glanced at Malik and Sarah in the rearview mirror, both quiet and wide-eyed, still processing the chaos they had just left behind. Janet tried to calm her racing thoughts, but the enormity of what she had done hit her in waves. She had taken the biggest step toward freedom, but now she faced the uncertainty of what came next. Lisa had arranged to meet Janet at a nearby gas station just outside of town, a temporary safe haven before they moved to the apartment. As Janet pulled into the parking lot, she saw Lisa's car already parked near the entrance. Janet felt a sense of relief wash over her as she parked beside her friend. Lisa stepped out, waving as Janet got out of the car. Are you okay? Lisa asked, her eyes filled with concern as she glanced at the kids in the back seat. Janet nodded, though her hands were still shaking. We're okay. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Michael knows something is up. I don't know what he'll do. Lisa hugged her tightly, offering comfort and strength. You did the right thing. You're safe now, and we'll make sure it stays that way. But as they talked, Janet's phone buzzed in her pocket. Her heart sank when she saw Michael's name flashing on the screen. She hesitated for a moment before declining the call. Her body tensed. She knew he wasn't going to let this go easily. The next hour passed in tense silence as they prepared to leave. Janet could feel the weight of every decision hanging over her. Her children were depending on her, and though she had taken the first step, she knew Michael wouldn't give up control so easily. And then it happened. Just as they were about to leave, another car screeched into the parking lot. Janet's stomach twisted as she recognized it. Michael. He had followed them. Before Janet could react, Michael jumped out of the car, slamming the door behind him as he stormed toward her. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes wild with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing, Janet? He shouted, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of everyone nearby. Janet instinctively stepped back, shielding Malik and Sarah behind her. Lisa moved closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but the tension was unbearable. You can't just take my kids and leave me. Michael's voice was shaking, his anger barely controlled. Get back in the car, Janet. We're going home. Janet felt the familiar surge of fear, the same fear that had kept her trapped for so many years. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't alone. She had Lisa by her side, and most importantly, she had her children's future to protect. "No, Michael," Janet said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "We're not going back. We're leaving." Michael's face twisted in disbelief. "What are you talking about? You can't just walk away from everything. You need me. You'll never make it without me." Janet took a deep breath, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. "I don't need you, Michael. Not anymore. I'm done living under your control. The kids and I deserve a life where we don't have to be afraid of you." "You're making a mistake," Michael growled, stepping closer. "You're ruining everything. I've given you everything, and this is how you repay me." Janet felt her heart pounding, but she refused to back down. "What you gave me was a life of fear, of control. You didn't give me freedom, you took it from me. And I'm not going to let you take anything else." For a moment, Michael just stood there, glaring at her, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Janet could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between his desire for control and the realization that he was losing her, that he had already lost her. "You think you can take my kids and run?" Michael sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you're strong enough to do this on your own?" Janet met his gaze, no longer intimidated by the man who had once made her feel so small. "I don't think, Michael." "I know." Michael's face darkened. "You'll regret this, Janet. You'll regret leaving me." At that moment, Lisa stepped forward, her presence calm but firm. "Michael, you need to leave. Right now. If you don't, we're calling the police." Michael's eyes flicked to Lisa, the threat of authority causing him to hesitate. He looked back at Janet, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had always believed that Janet would never leave, that she would always be under his control. But now, faced with the reality of her independence, he was lost. "You're nothing without me," he spat, his voice low and venomous. Janet didn't flinch. "No, Michael. I'm everything without you." With those final words, Michael's shoulders sagged in defeat. He stood there for a moment, his fists clenched, before turning on his heel and walking back to his car. Janet watched as he slammed the door and sped away, the sound of his tires screeching into the distance. For a long moment, Janet stood in the parking lot, her heart still racing. The confrontation had drained her, but there was also a sense of relief, a weight that had been lifted off her shoulders. "You did it," Lisa said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Janet's arm. "You stood up to him." Janet nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Lisa smiled gently. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Janet looked down at Malik and Sarah, who were still clutching her hands, their eyes wide but trusting. She knelt down to their level, pulling them into a tight embrace. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "We're going to be okay." As they got into Lisa's car and drove away, Janet felt the beginnings of a new chapter. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She was free. The days following Janet's departure from Michael were a blur of emotions: relief, fear, and a cautious hope for the future. The transition into their new life wasn't easy. The small apartment Lisa had helped her secure felt cramped compared to the house they had left behind, but it was safe. And for the first time in years, Janet didn't have to live with the oppressive fear of Michael's presence. The children, Malik and Sarah, adjusted slowly. The tension in the air between their parents had been a constant in their young lives, and now, without it, they were unsure how to feel. But as the days passed, they began to relax, their laughter becoming more frequent, and their nervous glances disappearing. Janet took solace in those small signs of healing. Every step forward felt like a victory. One evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, casting a warm glow through the window of their new apartment, Janet sat on the couch with Malik and Sarah beside her. They had been quiet most of the afternoon, but now Malik spoke up. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice small but filled with the curiosity of a boy on the edge of understanding. His eyes, so much like Janet's, searched her face for reassurance. Janet smiled softly, pulling both children closer. "Yes, Malik. We're going to be okay," she said, her voice filled with a confidence she hadn't felt in years. "It's going to take time, but we're free now, and we have each other. That's what matters." Sarah, always the quieter of the two, rested her head on Janet's lap, her small fingers gripping her mother's hand. "I like it here," she whispered. "It feels nice." Janet's heart swelled with emotion. She hadn't been sure how the children would handle the change, but hearing Sarah's words brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The apartment may not have been perfect, but it was theirs. It was the beginning of something new, something better. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, Janet sat alone by the window, looking out at the world beyond. She had left behind a life of control, of fear, and had stepped into the unknown. But as the moonlight filtered through the window, she didn't feel lost. For the first time in years, she felt grounded, rooted in the knowledge that she had taken her life back. The challenges weren't over. Michael had already tried to contact her several times, his messages filled with both anger and pleading. He had even shown up at the apartment once, banging on the door and demanding to see the children. But Janet had called the police, and with Lisa's help, she had filed for a restraining order. The legal battle for custody was looming, but Janet was ready. She wasn't afraid of Michael anymore. He could no longer control her. As the weeks passed, Janet found a part-time job at a local office, working flexible hours that allowed her to still be there for Malik and Sarah. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Every day, she built a little more of her independence, rediscovering the parts of herself that Michael had tried to suppress for so long. She remembered the woman she used to be, strong, resilient, capable, and slowly, she became that woman again. One afternoon, after a long day at work, Janet received a letter in the mail. It was from Michael's lawyer, the beginning of the custody battle she had been dreading. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The words on the page blurred as she read them, but she didn't cry. Instead, a calm determination settled over her. This was the next step in her journey, and Janet knew she would fight for her children with everything she had. She wasn't the same woman who had cowered under Michael's control. She was a mother fighting for her family, and nothing, no legal threats, no manipulations, would take them away from her. Janet looked over at a framed photo of Malik and Sarah sitting on the table, their smiling faces a reminder of why she had made the difficult decision to leave. They deserved a life of freedom, of love, and of safety, and she would make sure they had it no matter what. That night, as she tucked the kids into bed, Malik asked her again, "Are we really going to be okay, Mom?" Janet knelt down beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, Malik," she whispered, her voice steady and sure. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be happy." As she left the room, Janet felt a quiet strength settle within her. She had faced the worst and she had survived. There were more battles ahead, but Janet wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had found her independence and no one, not even Michael, could take that away from her.